The rain fell relentlessly, each drop sliding down the window pane, blurring the world outside. On that afternoon, the city of Prague seemed unusually quiet, the bustling streets now swallowed by an air of somberness. In the silence of the cemetery, where the souls of the departed rested, a funeral took place. Adrian stood motionless before the grave of his older brother, Lucas. His face revealed nothing, but inside, an ocean of turmoil churned. He couldn't forget the day he received the news, the day Lucas had died in an accident, when his entire world had come crashing down. It wasn't just the loss of his brother. It was the realization that Adrian had been hiding something for years, a truth he'd tried to suppress for as long as he could. Behind him, Elena, Lucas's widow, stood, her hands clenched tightly, struggling to hold back the emotions she had been drowning in for so long. She cried, but not just because she had lost her beloved husband. It was because Lucas had left behind only memories, and those memories were becoming harder to hold on to. In the nights that followed his death, Elena found herself sinking into an emptiness she couldn't fill. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find a way out of the void that had opened up in her soul. Adrian's gaze lingered on Elena, and he could feel her unease, her loneliness. For the first time, he realized something. It wasn't just the sorrow of Lucas's passing that had cast a shadow over the day. It was the strange, undeniable longing that had crept into Adrian's heart. A longing he had never allowed himself to acknowledge before. He had loved Elena for as long as he could remember, even when Lucas was alive, even when he had been nothing more than the respectful younger brother. But now, with Lucas gone, these feelings could no longer be contained. Adrian knew this couldn't be. It was wrong, it was unacceptable. But what could he do? He couldn't just stand by and watch Elena suffer in silence. He realized that, in this moment, it was he who could fill that void, not Lucas. The funeral continued, with mourners offering their condolences, but Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. He watched Elena as she stood there, her face pale, her eyes clouded with sorrow. He couldn't help but feel that, just like him, she was starting to realize something too, something neither of them could put into words. After the funeral, the city of Prague seemed even colder, the streets more desolate. Adrian found himself walking aimlessly through the old town, his thoughts tangled with everything that had happened over the past few days. The weight of his brother's death was still heavy on his chest, but it was the emotions he'd never dared acknowledge that were overwhelming him now. How had things come to this? How had he allowed himself to fall in love with Elena, his brother's wife? It seemed almost impossible to think about, yet the more he tried to push it away, the more his feelings grew. He walked past the familiar streets where he and Lucas had spent their youth, where they had laughed and shared memories. Every corner seemed to hold a piece of his brother, a piece of the life they had all shared. But now, everything felt broken, like the pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit together. Adrian's mind raced. How could he face Elena, knowing what he was feeling? Would she ever look at him the same way again? Would she feel the same pull, the same connection? He couldn't be sure, but something in the way she had looked at him earlier, the fleeting moment when their gazes met, told him she might be struggling with her own emotions. But no, he thought to himself. It was too soon. She was still grieving, and Adrian had no right to disturb her with his feelings. He was her brother-in-law, the one who should be there for her as a support, not someone who complicated her life even further. Yet, the more he denied it, the more the truth gnawed at him. He was falling in love with her, and that truth was becoming undeniable. A few days passed, and Adrian couldn't stop thinking about Elena. He had avoided her since the funeral, telling himself it was better that way. But on a cold evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast a golden glow over the city, he found himself standing outside her apartment building. He had no intention of going in. He just wanted to see her, to know she was okay. But when he saw her walking down the stairs, her face pale, her eyes tired, he couldn't hold back any longer. "Elena," Adrian called out, his voice soft but firm. She froze for a moment, as if startled by his presence. Then she turned, her eyes locking with his. There was a moment of silence between them, an unspoken tension that hung in the air. Elena smiled faintly, but the sadness in her eyes was impossible to ignore. "Adrian," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "I just wanted to check on you," he said, his gaze steady, though his heart was racing. I know it's been hard. She nodded, looking down at her hands, which were nervously clutching the fabric of her coat. It's been really hard, she admitted. I don't think I can ever get used to this. To him not being here. Adrian stepped closer, his heart pounding as he reached out, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to be alone in this, Elena. I'm here for you. Always. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, trying to find the truth in his words. There was something in his gaze, something that seemed to reach deep inside her, stirring emotions she had been trying to bury. For a moment, she almost let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, there could be something more between them. But then, just as quickly, she pulled away, her eyes darting to the ground. I can't do this, she whispered. Not now? Not like this. Adrian's heart sank, but he understood. It was too soon for her, too soon for both of them. But that didn't stop the ache in his chest, the longing that still burned inside him. I understand, he said quietly, stepping back. I'll give you time, Elena. I just want you to know I'm here, whenever you're ready. With a soft nod, Elena turned and walked back inside her apartment, leaving Adrian standing alone on the street. He knew that what he wanted wasn't something he could rush, but the pull between them was undeniable. He only hoped that, someday, she would see it too. Days passed, but nothing seemed to change. Adrian continued to visit Elena's apartment occasionally, but their conversations were always short, filled with polite words and awkward silences. He could feel the distance between them growing, and it pained him. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he knew he couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. Then, one evening, after another long, lonely day, Adrian received a call from Elena. His heart skipped a beat as he answered the phone. Adrian. Elena's voice came through, shaky but determined. Can you come over? I need to talk to you. Adrian's pulse quickened. This could be the moment he had been waiting for, the moment where things might change. I'll be right there, he said, barely able to contain his excitement. The city of Prague had long since gone quiet when Adrian arrived at Elena's apartment. The streets were empty, and the flickering streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. He hesitated for a brief moment before knocking on her door. He didn't know what to expect. Was this a conversation of closure, or the beginning of something neither of them could stop? The door opened slowly, and there she was. Elena looked exhausted, as if she hadn't slept in days. Her long auburn hair was loose, slightly messy, and she was wrapped in a thick sweater, her arms hugging herself as though trying to hold something inside. Come in, she murmured, stepping aside. Adrian entered cautiously, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. There was a warmth to the space, but an unmistakable loneliness clung to the air. A few framed photos of Lucas still sat on the coffee table, untouched. He felt a pang of guilt, but it wasn't enough to stop him from wanting to be there. Elena walked toward the small couch and sat down, pulling her knees up against her chest. Adrian followed, taking the chair across from her. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Finally, she sighed. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Do what? She met his gaze, her green eyes filled with uncertainty. Move forward. Live without him. Everything feels empty. He nodded, understanding completely. I know. Elena inhaled sharply, as if gathering the courage to say what was really on her mind. And then there's you, she finally said. Adrian felt his heartbeat quicken. Me? She hesitated but didn't look away. I don't know what's happening between us, Adrian. I don't know if I should even acknowledge it. His breath caught in his throat. You feel it too. She closed her eyes briefly, as if struggling against herself. Yes, she confessed. And it terrifies me. Adrian exhaled, feeling both relief and apprehension. Elena, I would never. He stopped himself, shaking his head. I would never want to hurt you, or disrespect what you had with Lucas. But I can't lie to myself anymore. I can't pretend that I don't. Don't say it, she interrupted, her voice trembling. If you say it, then it becomes real. He swallowed hard, fighting the urge to reach for her. It's already real, Elena. Tears welled up in her eyes. But it's wrong. Adrian leaned closer. Is it? Or is it just something we weren't prepared for? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she wiped at her tears and turned her gaze to the window, where the city lights flickered in the distance. Lucas loved you, she said after a long pause. He trusted you. Adrian's chest tightened. And I loved him. I still do. But that doesn't change what I feel for you. Elena shook her head, standing up abruptly. I need time, she whispered. Adrian stood as well, his hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to tell her he'd wait as long as she needed, but before he could speak, she turned away. You should go. His heart ached at her words, but he respected them. Without another word, he walked to the door, pausing only for a second before stepping out into the cold night air. As he walked away, he knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. In the weeks that followed, Adrian and Elena kept their distance. They saw each other only when necessary, at family gatherings, at quiet memorials for Lucas, but they never spoke about that night. And yet, the tension remained, unspoken but ever-present. Then one evening, fate intervened. Adrian had spent the day at the university where he worked, trying to drown himself in research, but his mind was elsewhere. It was always elsewhere now. On Elena, on the way her voice had broken when she admitted she felt something too. He had just stepped out of his office when his phone rang. Elena. He answered immediately, his pulse quickening. There was silence on the other end for a moment before she finally spoke. I need you. 2 simple words, but they shattered the walls he had been trying to rebuild. Where are you? He asked urgently. At home, she murmured. I'm on my way. When Adrian arrived at her apartment, he found her standing in the doorway, as if she had been waiting for him. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between relief and uncertainty. She stepped aside, letting him in. He noticed immediately that something had changed. The room was dimly lit, a single lamp casting a soft glow over the space. The air between them felt electric. I don't know what to do anymore, she admitted, her voice raw. I tried to push you away. I tried to convince myself that this wasn't happening, that it wasn't right. Adrian held his breath, afraid to move, afraid to say the wrong thing. But I can't, she whispered. His heart pounded. Elena. She stepped closer, so close that he could feel her warmth. Tell me this isn't just grief. That it's not just loneliness making me feel this way. Adrian reached up, gently cupping her face, his thumb tracing the tear-stained skin beneath her eyes. This isn't grief, he said firmly. And it's not loneliness. It's us. She let out a shaky breath. And then, finally, she leaned into him. Their lips met in a kiss that was both hesitant and desperate, as if they had spent too long denying what had always been there. It wasn't rushed, wasn't reckless. It was years of emotions finally breaking free. When they pulled away, Adrian searched her face for doubt, for hesitation, but there was none. I don't know what happens next, she admitted softly. Neither do I, he said. But we'll figure it out. Together. For the first time in a long time, Elena allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could feel something again. And for Adrian, there was no turning back. The morning light seeped through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the quiet apartment. Elena lay still, staring at the ceiling, her body curled beneath the sheets. She wasn't sure what she had expected to feel when she woke up, but the weight pressing down on her chest was heavier than she anticipated. Beside her, Adrian stirred. His arm draped over her waist, instinctively pulling her closer. The warmth of his body against hers sent a shiver down her spine. It felt right, so right that it terrified her. Adrian pressed a soft kiss against her bare shoulder, his voice husky with sleep. Morning. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she exhaled slowly, eyes still fixed on the ceiling. Adrian noticed the stiffness in her posture, the hesitation in her breath. He gently shifted, resting his head on his hand as he looked at her. Elena. Finally, she turned to face him. There was no regret in her eyes, but there was something else, something he couldn't quite place. This changes everything, she whispered. Adrian nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I know. She swallowed, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the sheets. I don't know if I'm ready for what comes next. His heart clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. Then we take it one step at a time. Elena let out a shaky breath and nodded, but deep down, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. It didn't take long before their secret was no longer just theirs to keep. The first to find out was Lucas's mother, Marianne. A woman of old European traditions, she had been mourning her eldest son deeply, spending most of her days in silence, clutching old photographs as if they could bring him back. When she heard whispers, rumors that Adrian had been spending nights at Elena's apartment, she refused to believe it at first. But then she saw it with her own eyes. One afternoon, Adrian was leaving Elena's apartment when he spotted Marianne standing at the bottom of the stairs, her hands clenched into fists. "Mother," he breathed, stopping mid-step. She didn't say a word at first. She only stared at him, her blue eyes sharp, filled with something between heartbreak and fury. Finally, she spoke. "Tell me it's not true." Adrian's jaw tightened. "I can't." Marianne inhaled sharply, her face contorted in disgust. "You dishonor your brother's memory," she spat. "You stand at his grave and whisper his name, but behind closed doors, you lay with his wife." Adrian flinched as if she had struck him. "It's not like that. How dare you?" she hissed, stepping closer. "He loved you. He trusted you. And this is how you repay him." Adrian clenched his fists. "I love her." The words were out before he could stop them. Marianne's expression faltered, as if she had been slapped. "You what?" "I love her," he repeated, voice steady this time. "I know how this looks. I know what people will say. But this, what I feel for her, is not something I can ignore." Marianne's eyes darkened with something more than anger. "You think love justifies betrayal?" "No," Adrian said, stepping closer. "But love isn't a choice. I didn't plan this. I didn't want this. But it happened, and I won't turn my back on it." Marianne's hands trembled at her sides. "If you continue down this path," she said coldly, "then you are no longer my son." Adrian felt as if the ground had been ripped from beneath him. "Mother." "No." She shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. "You've already made your choice, Adrian. Now, I'm making mine." Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Adrian standing there, feeling more alone than he ever had before. Elena knew something was wrong the moment Adrian entered her apartment that night. He was quieter than usual, his movements slower, heavier. "What happened?" she asked gently, stepping closer. Adrian ran a hand through his hair. "She knows." Elena's stomach twisted. "Your mother?" He nodded. "And she's disowned me." Elena gasped, reaching for him, but he took a step back. "She said I betrayed Lucas. That I betrayed her." The pain in his voice was unbearable. Elena's heart clenched. She had known this would happen eventually, but she hadn't expected it to cut this deep. "I never wanted this," she whispered, guilt gnawing at her. Adrian looked up sharply. "Do you regret it?" Her lips parted, but no words came. "Elena," he said, voice quieter now, more vulnerable. "Do you regret us?" Tears burned her eyes. "I don't know." A flicker of hurt crossed his face before he masked it. "That's not the answer I was hoping for." She swallowed hard. "Adrian, I love you, but—" His entire body went still. "But—" She squeezed her eyes shut. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can carry this guilt for the rest of my life." Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Adrian took a deep breath, his jaw tight. "So what are you saying?" Elena shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. Maybe we need time apart." His breath hitched, as if the words had physically hurt him. "Elena, I need to think," she whispered. A muscle in his jaw tensed. He nodded slowly. "Okay." He turned to leave, but just as he reached the door, he paused. "I meant what I said," he murmured, without turning around. "I love you, even if you're not ready to say it back." And then he was gone. Elena collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. Because the truth was, she loved him too. But love had never been more complicated than it was now. The days that followed felt endless. Adrian tried to focus on his work, on the routine of daily life, but nothing could distract him from the emptiness Elena had left behind. The walls of his apartment, once a place of solitude, now felt suffocating. He hadn't called her. He wanted to. Every night, his hand hovered over his phone, tempted to dial her number. But she had asked for space, and he had no choice but to give it to her. At first, he thought she would reach out, that after a few days apart, she would miss him the way he missed her. But as the days turned to weeks, silence stretched between them like an unspoken goodbye. Then, one evening, Adrian found himself walking past the bookstore where Elena used to spend hours browsing. His feet moved before his mind could stop them. He stepped inside, the scent of paper and ink surrounding him, bringing back memories of the times they had spent there together. And then he saw her. She was standing near the window, flipping through a book, her long auburn hair catching the last light of the day. For a moment, Adrian felt relief just seeing her again. But then his heart sank. She wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, speaking in low tones, his hand lightly resting on the small of her back. Adrian recognized him. Daniel Novak, an old friend of Lucas's, someone who had always been there, lingering in the background. His chest tightened as he watched them, his hands clenching into fists. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something about the way Daniel was looking at her made his stomach churn. And then it happened. Elena laughed. A soft, hesitant laugh, but a laugh nonetheless. Adrian had been drowning in her absence. While she was moving on, Adrian didn't remember walking home that night. His mind was a storm, replaying the moment over and over. It wasn't until later, when the frustration became unbearable, that he found himself standing outside Elena's apartment once more. This time, he didn't hesitate before knocking. Elena opened the door, clearly startled to see him. "Adrian," she breathed. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, his presence filling the space. "Are you seeing him?" Elena's brows furrowed. "What? Daniel, are you seeing him?" Her lips parted, but no words came. Adrian exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I saw you, Elena. At the bookstore." She closed her eyes briefly. "Adrian, it's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," he demanded. She hesitated, and that hesitation felt like a knife to his heart. "He's been there for me," she admitted quietly. "After everything that happened, he's been someone I could talk to." Adrian laughed bitterly. "Of course he has." She frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that while I've been giving you space, respecting what you asked for, you've been spending time with him." Elena folded her arms, her expression hardening. "I never promised you anything, Adrian." His jaw tightened. "You didn't have to. We both know what this is." Silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything unspoken. Finally, Elena sighed, her voice softer. "I don't know what to do, Adrian. I'm scared. Every time I look at you, I see Lucas. And I know people are judging us. Your mother won't even speak to you anymore. If we do this, we lose everything." Adrian stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We don't lose everything, Elena. We have each other." She looked up at him, and for a moment, he saw the conflict in her eyes. Then, just as quickly, she turned away. "I need more time." Adrian swallowed hard. "And Daniel?" "He's just a friend," she whispered. "For now." "For now?" Adrian knew then that he was standing on the edge of something dangerous. If he pushed too hard, she would run. If he waited too long, he might lose her to someone else. And he wasn't sure which was worst. If the pain of seeing Elena with another man wasn't enough, Adrian soon found himself face to face with his mother once more. She came to his apartment unannounced, stepping inside as if she still had a right to be there. "We need to talk," she said firmly. Adrian crossed his arms. "I thought you disowned me." She ignored the bitterness in his tone. "This thing with Elena, it has to end." He stiffened. "I'm not discussing this with you." Marianne's gaze was sharp. "You don't see what you're doing, do you? You're destroying everything your brother built. His name, his memory. Do you think Lucas would want this?" Adrian's patience snapped. "Don't you dare use Lucas against me." "Then stop giving me a reason to," she shot back. "People are talking, Adrian. The family is ashamed. Elena is vulnerable, and you're taking advantage of that." His fists clenched. "I would never hurt her." "But you are," Marianne said coldly. "You're making her choose between love and loyalty. Between you and the life she built with Lucas. Do you really think that's fair?" Adrian exhaled sharply, his resolve wavering. Marianne took a step closer. "If you love her, truly love her, then walk away." The words hit him like a physical blow. Walk away. Was that what love meant? Letting go? He wasn't sure he could do that. A few nights later, Adrian found himself back at Elena's doorstep. This time, when she opened the door, he didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at her, waiting for something, anything. She stepped aside, letting him in. They sat in silence, the air between them thick with everything left unsaid. Finally, Elena whispered, "Did you mean it?" He looked at her. "Mean what?" "That you love me." His breath caught in his throat. Every word. She let out a shaky exhale. "I love you too." Adrian's heart pounded. "Then what's stopping us?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Because I'm afraid that if we do this, I'll lose myself. That I'll never be able to escape Lucas's shadow." Adrian reached for her hands. "We don't have to forget him, Elena. We just have to find a way to live." She shook her head. "I don't know how." He squeezed her hands. "Then let me show you." She hesitated. But then, finally, she whispered. Okay. And just like that, the walls began to fall. As days passed, Adrian and Elena tried to rebuild their connection, but the weight of their situation kept looming over them like a constant shadow. Even though they both wanted to move forward, the tension between their love and the chaos surrounding them only grew stronger. Elena felt it every time she saw her reflection in the mirror. Her face, once so full of hope, now carried the lines of confusion and guilt. She had wanted to find peace with Adrian, to find comfort in his arms, but the pressure of the past clung to her like an invisible chain. Every moment with him felt like a stolen fragment of happiness, a fleeting joy that could disappear the moment the world found out. But that wasn't her only fear. As much as she loved Adrian, she couldn't ignore the fear that one day, his love might not be enough. She wasn't the same person she was before Lucas's death. She had changed, and no matter how much she tried to convince herself that she could move on, there was always the guilt, the endless whispers in her mind telling her she was betraying something, someone. A week after their emotional confrontation, things seemed to settle for a brief moment. Adrian and Elena were learning how to navigate the silence between them, and though it wasn't easy, it felt like they were slowly finding a way to make their love work. But life, it seemed, had other plans. One evening, Elena received an unexpected text. It was from Daniel Novak. The message was simple, but its meaning was undeniable. We need to talk. It's important. Her heart sank. She hadn't heard from Daniel in days, and though she tried to convince herself that he was just a friend, she couldn't shake the feeling that he had more on his mind. When she met him the next day, she found him standing by the fountain in the town square, his dark eyes shadowed with concern. Daniel, she greeted, trying to hide the anxiety in her voice. Elena, he said softly, I've been thinking a lot about everything. About you, about Lucas, about Adrian. Elena felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. What's going on, Daniel? He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I've been watching you, Elena, and I can't just stand by and do nothing anymore. Her brow furrowed. What do you mean? I know you're in love with Adrian, he said bluntly, his voice calm but firm. But you're not the only one who loved Lucas. Elena's breath caught in her throat. What are you saying? Daniel took a step closer, his tone softer now. I've always been there for you, Elena. I've been supporting you. But the truth is, I'm not just doing this for Lucas anymore. I'm doing it for me. Because I can't pretend that I don't care about you. I can't keep watching you slip away with Adrian when I know how much you're hurting. She felt a rush of emotions, confusion, anger, guilt, all at once. She had never thought of Daniel that way, not in the way he was suggesting now. He was a friend, someone who had always been there for her. But this was something else. Daniel, I don't know what to say, she stammered. You're my friend, but I don't think I feel the same way. His eyes darkened, but he remained composed. I know, but you're confused, and I'm not the one who's going to let you hurt yourself. Elena shook her head. I'm not hurting anyone, but what I'm doing with Adrian, it's not about me hurting him or anyone else. I need to find myself again, Daniel. I need time. Daniel's gaze softened, but there was a sadness in his eyes. Time is running out, Elena. Time doesn't run out if you're honest with yourself, she replied, her voice trembling. Daniel didn't argue. He simply nodded and stepped back. I hope you figure it out, because I can't keep standing by and watching you suffer. With those words, he turned and walked away, leaving Elena standing in the cold, feeling more lost than ever. It wasn't long before Adrian heard the rumors. He had been trying to block out the world, focusing solely on his relationship with Elena, but the whispers were unavoidable. His friends, the people he trusted, began talking. The town had become a small, insular place where nothing stayed hidden for long. And now, the rumor was everywhere. Daniel Novak was in love with Elena. Adrian's heart dropped when he first heard the news. He had known Daniel and Elena shared a connection. Lucas's death had left them both scarred, but Adrian had believed that their bond was purely platonic. But now, seeing the way Daniel had been watching her lately, the way Elena's eyes seemed to linger on him during their last few encounters, Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than just friendship. He needed to confront her. He needed answers. That evening, he arrived at Elena's apartment, his mind clouded with doubt and confusion. When she opened the door, her face instantly softened, but the tension in the air was palpable. Adrian, what's wrong? I need to know. Elena, he said, his voice tight. Is there something between you and Daniel? Elena's face paled, and for a moment, she was silent, her lips parted as if trying to find the right words. I don't know, Adrian, she whispered. I don't want to hurt you, but everything is so complicated right now. I'm still grieving, still trying to figure out who I am without Lucas. And Daniel, he's been there for me in ways I didn't expect. Adrian's chest tightened. I've been there for you too. But you're pushing me away, Elena. You're pulling away from everything we've built. She shook her head. It's not about you, Adrian. It's about me. I need to figure things out. I need to find out who I am without the past controlling me. Adrian's heart broke at the sight of her tears. And what if I'm part of that past, Elena? What if I'm the one that you need to leave behind to truly heal? Her eyes widened at his words. No, Adrian. I don't want that. But Adrian could see the conflict in her eyes, the uncertainty that made his heart ache. He stepped closer to her, gently cupping her face. Then stay with me, and let's figure this out together. But Elena couldn't answer. Instead, she pulled away from him, tears streaming down her face. I don't know if I can. Adrian left her apartment that night feeling more uncertain than ever. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep holding on if she wasn't ready to make a choice. The next few days were filled with agonizing silence between them. Elena stayed away, and Adrian buried himself in his work, trying to block out the constant ache in his chest. And then, one evening, he received a message from Elena. I've made my decision. Let's meet tomorrow. It was the moment of truth. The moment that would determine the future of their relationship. Would Elena choose Adrian, or would she walk away for good? The following day, Adrian barely made it through the hours leading up to his meeting with Elena. His mind was racing, flooded with questions he didn't have answers to. Would she finally choose him? Or had Daniel, with his quiet support and unshakable patience, won her over? By the time the sun began to set over Prague, Adrian was already waiting at their usual spot, a small, secluded cafe near the Vltava River, a place where they had once shared laughter and unspoken confessions. But tonight, there was no laughter. When Elena arrived, she looked different, not in a drastic way, but something about her posture, the way she carried herself, told Adrian that she had finally made up her mind. She sat across from him, folding her hands together on the wooden table, her green eyes filled with emotion. I don't want to waste any time, she said softly. I know how much I've hurt you, Adrian. And I know I've been running from the truth because I was afraid of what it would mean. Adrian's heart pounded. And what is the truth, Elena? She inhaled sharply, holding his gaze. I love you. Relief crashed over him like a tidal wave. But then, she continued, her voice breaking. But I don't know if that's enough. The air between them tightened. I can't love you the way you deserve, she admitted, her hands trembling slightly. Not when I'm still haunted by the past. Not when I still feel Lucas in every shadow of my life. I thought I could separate my love for him from what I feel for you, but I can't. Adrian swallowed hard, the ache in his chest unbearable. Elena, she reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. If I stay with you now, I know I'll end up resenting myself. I'll always wonder if I chose you because I was lonely, because I needed something to fill the emptiness. And that's not fair, to you, or to me. He shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. We can figure this out. Together. Tears welled in her eyes. I wish that were true, but I need to do this alone. I need to find out who I am without Lucas. Without you. The finality in her words was like a dagger to his heart. Adrian had fought so hard, believed that love would be enough to break through the ghosts of the past. But as he looked at Elena now, he realized something. She wasn't choosing Daniel. She wasn't choosing anyone. She was choosing herself. And that was something he had no right to take away from her. Slowly, he nodded, his fingers tightening around hers one last time. If this is what you need, then I won't stop you. Elena let out a shaky breath, as if she had been holding it in for too long. Thank you, she whispered. He wanted to say more, to tell her that he would wait for her, that he would always love her no matter how much time passed. But he knew that wasn't what she needed. So instead, he simply stood up, placed a soft kiss on her forehead, and walked away. And for the first time, Adrian realized that sometimes love wasn't about holding on. Sometimes love meant letting go. Weeks turned into months. Elena left Prague for a while, traveling to places she had always wanted to visit, rediscovering parts of herself that had been buried under years of grief. She sent Adrian a few postcards, short, simple notes that spoke of new beginnings, but never of love. And Adrian? He stayed. He learned how to live without waiting for Elena to return. He picked up the pieces of his heart and rebuilt himself, even when it felt impossible. One day, he received a final postcard from Paris. I hope you're happy, truly happy, because that's what I want for both of us. No regrets, no looking back, no signature, just her words. Adrian read it once, then twice. And for the first time in a long time, he smiled. Because he finally understood. Love didn't always have to end in forever. Sometimes, love was just a lesson in finding yourself again. Years later, Adrian found himself sitting in a cafe, much like the one where he had once shared bittersweet moments with Elena. The city had changed, and so had he. He had moved on, not in the way people expected, but in a way that felt right. He had learned how to love again, not just someone else, but himself. As he sipped his coffee, a familiar figure passed by the window. Elena. She looked different, happier, free. Their eyes met for a brief second. She smiled. And for the first time in years, Adrian felt no pain, no regret, just peace. Because sometimes, love wasn't about endings. It was about learning when to let go. And he had finally learned. Final thoughts. A love that was never meant to stay. This wasn't a story of soulmates who defied fate. It wasn't about a love that overcame every obstacle. It was about two people who loved deeply, but who ultimately needed to find their own paths. Because not all love stories end in a forever. Some love stories simply teach us how to begin again. The end.